The idea here is not necessarily to do a multi-hour walkthrough of different approaches and take up your whole day. I also don't think most of you are designing motorcycle seats for a living, so I don't know how useful that would be. So I'd more like to show you what options exist and if they might work for the project that you're working on. I'll also give you the basics to get started and give you some resources on where to learn more if any of these approaches look like they're going to work for you, because we already have a lot of existing guides and videos for these approaches. With all that said, let's get started with approach number one, using sketch pictures and some surfacing. Step number one is taking your pictures, and I have a few recommendations here. First, you really want to take the time to set up good reference pictures because it's going to save you a lot of time and get you a more accurate model in the long run. But the best way to do it is by carefully aligning your camera angle to match the sketch planes that you plan on using in SOLIDWORKS. So for this first one, I'm using the top plane, for example, and I try to get directly above and use the symmetry of the seat to align my picture. Tip number two is to try some type of reference for scaling. So you can use a feature with a known dimension, but in my right view, I just added a ruler to help scale it. And we'll see how to use that later once we get into SOLIDWORKS. The last suggestion is try to use a colored background if possible. I didn't use it for this project, but if you have a solid background, you can take advantage of some auto tracing in SOLIDWORKS instead of sketching your own profiles. It works really well for something like a logo, for example. Once you're happy with your pictures, you can open SOLIDWORKS. Then open a sketch on the plane that correlates to your picture angle. So I'm opening one on the right plane and going to the sketch picture tool. Then I can import my side view picture, and I try to use the low resolution option because it loads a little bit faster. Once it's imported, start aligning and scaling your picture. So I decided to use the sort of end of the seat as my origin, and then I aligned the tabletop with my top plane in SOLIDWORKS. And this little blue line here is our scale tool for the sketch picture. So position that line where your known dimension is and apply that dimension, and then it's going to scale the whole picture based on that line and that dimension. Once I had it roughly sized up, I started trying to orient the picture more accurately using a sketch line and just kind of referenced it with the tabletop. Then I repeated that process for the top view. Same idea here, except I didn't use the scale tool. I just sized and aligned it based off of my existing picture. And I used features on the seat to help kind of line things up. I was specifically using the intersection points of the fabric seams on the seat, for example, here, and I'm going to use those again later. Then I got an above view and used a midpoint line to just try and dial in the orientation and the angle and scale and all that stuff a little bit better. The next step is start to set up your sketch profiles for surfacing. And the spline tool is really powerful here for tracing out your sketch pictures, especially when with these curvy organic shapes. It typically works really well to use more points when a curve is changing or it's a complicated geometry, and less points when it's roughly the same curve or more gradual curve. So use that spline tool to draw out the profile of the part wherever you need it. And then I ended up splitting the spline up and to two halves and making the top half just construction geometry. That way I could still use it for reference, but I could just extrude out the bottom half of it with a simple surface and use that as the bottom of my seat. I'm not really worried about any of the geometry going on underneath the seat. I just kind of want a reference there. Then I repeat the process for my top view and make sure the spline is coincident on the original spline from my right view. This one was a little trickier because my picture turns out wasn't perfectly aligned, but I just tried to find a happy medium between the two sides. So I used a construction line on one side and just kind of try to take advantage of some of that symmetry. Because I'm also only going to be drawing out and using curves for one half of this seat, I can split it down the middle and I can mirror it over once I'm finished with everything. But once that profile is sketched out, I can use it to trim that bottom tray piece and get that kind of dialed in. Then I can move on to the guide curves for the lofted surface. It helps to try and plan out how these surfaces are going to be broken up and how it may make it easier to work on later if you have to make adjustments. So I decided to use those fabric seams again and break the curve up into two separate surfaces along that one main seam. And I'll use guide curves at the front where those seams intersect and one at the back where the seams intersect. So by holding Control and then clicking the front plane, I can kind of drag it out and create a new plane at that position where the first seam is at the back. And once that's dropped into place, I can drop a sketch point on that plane and then flip between the two views to roughly position it based on the sketch pictures. But I ended up actually taking some real world measurements and just tried to dial in that seam position a little bit more accurately using that instead. The picture got me pretty close, but again, I don't think my angle was perfect. So an alternative option and probably better option here is using a third sketch picture and a third angle to help dial in those guide curves. But I went ahead and kept working with this process, and I repeated the same thing for the point up front, got it set up, and don't mind some of the crazy camera work here. But once I have those points, I moved on to using the spline tool again, and this time I made sure the endpoints of the spline had a pierce relationship with the sketch profiles that I had done previously. And I took advantage of the control polygon option for the spline. And I really like this one for manipulating curves. I think it just helps you kind of dial them in a little bit better. I also mirrored the curve and made 1/2 a construction line just to add some tangency and help me dial in the shape of the curve overall. Once I was happy, I repeated that same process for the other guide curve. And with those set up, I again wanted to split my surface up and use that main seam. So I did that by using a 3D sketch, which can be a really quick and easy approach for something like this. So I drew out a spline and then I flipped between my view orientations to manipulate that spline in the 3 different dimensions to roughly match the curve of the seam. The position isn't 100% accurate here because I used those measurements earlier, but the picture is still a really great reference to dial in the curve. The final piece is kind of pulling everything together with some surfacing. And I start by lofting a surface between the 2 profiles, and then I use the guide curves to dial it in. The first part of it looked really good, so I repeated that same process for the second surface. And I had most of the seat done now, so just had to finish up with the back part, another guide curve, and another surface loft. Then I went back and started adding some surfaces, trimming them, and just getting it cleaned up and ready to turn into a solid body. The last piece was using a filled surface to patch up that area at the back of the seat, and I used some tangency on one of those edges to capture the curvature a little bit better. And then the final last step here is putting everything together to create that solid body. So I mirrored all the surfaces across the right plane and knitted everything together to create the solid body, which looks reasonably accurate based on the sketch pictures and just kind of referencing the seat in real life. So it's really pretty impressive what you can do with just a few pictures and some basic surfacing skills. This is a relatively simple example, but hopefully it's a good one to get you started and give you an idea of how to use these tools.